Welcome to I See What You Mean, a podcast about how people get on the same page or don't, or perhaps shouldn't. Today my guest is Richard Spires. Richard's worked in the technology industry for more than 35 years in government and private sector executive positions, and also volunteered in IT associations where he and I met. Richard, welcome to the show.
Lou, thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure. I look forward to our conversation. Why don't you start with a short bio about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I am a technologist at heart, a couple engineering degrees. Came out of school and went into the private sector first in an IT consulting organization. We did work mainly for the U.S. federal government, but also for some private sector firms. And, I ended up spending 16 years there and rose through those ranks, became a senior vice president, but then had an opportunity to join a firm as the chief operating officer of a software product company of all things, doing data analytics software in the financial services sector. But what my real, I think, claim to fame, so to speak, is when I was asked to go into the U.S. federal government. First at the IRS, I went in to run what was called their business systems modernization program, a multi-billion-dollar IT modernization program. And then I became their chief information officer for a few years there at the IRS. I stepped out of government, and then I was asked to come back in, become the CIO at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where I served for about 4 years. Then I stepped out of government again in 2013, and since then I've done a number of things. I was the CEO of a learning company called Learning Tree. And do some consulting now and sit on a few boards and
write books.
I write books. That's right. I do write the books, Lou. So
which I want to start with, and I want to start with the book you wrote last year, Success in the Technology Field: A Guide for Advancing Your Career. So I actually read it. I reviewed it. I liked it a lot, and I'm going to give it to one of my daughters. One's in the technology field, one's in a science field, but one's in the technology field, and I'm going to give it to her. So you cover a lot in that book from early in a young professional's career to later in a career, and you cover a lot of aspects of career. It's quite comprehensive. What role would you say? What would be the place of the ability to get people on the same page these days in a technology career?
Yeah, Lou. Let me just start out by saying that point about getting people on the same page is so critically important in any field. And I know we'll dive into some particulars here, but back to the book, and thank you for having read it, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. I talk about 12 traits in the book, and as you say, it's really covers your whole career from start to finish. But there are two in particular where I really feel this idea of getting on the same page comes to the fore. So one of the traits I talk about in the technology field, if you want to be successful in technology, things are delivered in the technology field through projects. And your ability to be a good project team member, and then your ability to manage projects effectively, whether they're small or very, very large, is really critical to many people being successful in technology. And your point is well taken. This idea of being on the same page. Most projects I have seen that fail, they don't have. It's not like they're trying to do things that are technology impossible or something.
Right.
I mean, they're a real stretch. The technology is there, but the ability to garner a team and get them all pointed in the right direction, if you will, on the same page.
Right.
Another term I like to talk about is, are we aligned? Are we aligned on where we're headed?
Right.
Is so critical to project and program management. And it's especially, then the larger and more complex, the more critical it becomes. So if you've got technologists working on a project and you've got business analysts, let's say, working on a project that represent the business side, and you can't get all on the same page, you're going to have failure. I've just seen it time and time and time again. So I'd say the one trait around project management is very, very critical. And then I would say the second one, another trait I talk about is leadership. Now, leadership comes in many forms, right? You can be a leader of even managing people. You can lead through thought leadership and examples you set and the mentorships you give to others. But if you're a leader of people, a lot of it is making sure you're generally headed in the same direction, which is back to the very point you made when you started this about getting on the same page. And so I think your point about it being so critical, and you even having a podcast around this topic, is very, very insightful of you, one, and two, it does cross, as I say, many disciplines, but in particular in the technology field, delivering projects well and leading people are the two areas that I would think that this most pertains.
There's some important points in there. Let's unpack a little bit. But first, tell me what you mean when you say technologist. And you've defined,
Well,
you identified yourself that way. You said, I am a technologist.
I did. Yeah. Well, and in the book, I kind of describe a few different types of technologists. And, a technologist isn't somebody that's got a PhD necessarily in physics or something like that. It can be.
Right,
I mean, you can have technologists that are very, very deep academically and theoretically. But I talk about technologists that are like myself that tended to apply technology to business problems. That's been kind of my career path. And by the way, I even talk about being success in the technology field. I even talk about salespeople. Who are the best technology-related salespeople I know that really know how to sell technology?
I remember that.
Products? They get to understand their customers and their customers' issues well, and how it is that my product or my service can best align and address your challenge or your as a customer.
Right.
That is another, if you will, that sales role is another technology role in my view. Okay.
Well, and that the reason I asked is because you talked about being aligned on where we're headed. So I think I took that as a definition of getting on the same page, of operating definition. And what I see is different parties involved in that effort. They come from different worlds. They've got different, perhaps, roles and responsibilities, different objectives, maybe even different masters they're serving, right?
Correct.
And the leader, like you said, could be the CIO, CEO, doesn't have to be a chief, could be the project, the PM, the project manager. The challenge is that somehow, and I want to talk about how, but somehow they help people bring those worlds together, right? The different worlds that people live in and the different things that they see, and bring them together in a way that something shared or mutual has to come from that. Otherwise, people would remain on their own pages.
Well, you brought up an excellent point, which is in many instances, particularly in technology-related endeavors, projects, programs, whatever it may be, you call it, you've got a diversity of backgrounds of people, and as you say. So how do you get them on the same page?
Right.
And so this is multi-layered. Let's take a large program, and I've run a number of them. At the working level, so much of it is about the right kinds of communications and meeting people where they're at,
right,
so to speak. Educating people effectively. I kind of view that as a big part of a project manager's role, is to make sure that everybody understands what our objectives are, and the role that everybody's playing to meet those objectives, and how are we going to do that? I mean, at a pretty good level of detail, actually, so that everybody feels part of the team and that they can understand that. And that's that isn't a one and done thing. It's not like you kick off, you have a 2-hour kickoff, and
you're good.
You educate everybody, and here's our plan, and then you leave it alone.
No.
As you know, projects constantly are changing, they're morphing, you're learning things. And so it's a constant education and communications endeavor. And so I think that's how, on a project team basis, that I've seen that being successful. But let's look at the other aspect of this is so important, which is what I call the stakeholder basis. So who are the stakeholders of a project or a program? Let's talk about that. If you've got a project to improve a business process for, let's say, an organization, could be a project, it could be a private sector company, it could be a government agency, it really doesn't matter what the organization is. The stakeholder, I mean, who owns that business process, right? Who's responsible for that, or who's the benefactor if we can improve that business process?
Right.
Those are stakeholders. Likewise, in government, it even gets more complex. You've got different auditors, you've got different parts of the agency you might deal with that are also stakeholders. And so, how do you get them
Yeah.
all aligned or on the same page, as you say? And that gets into what I talk about a lot, program governance, which is a model that I really worked on, particularly at the IRS and at DHS, to more effectively, as you say, get everybody on the same page so that we could make better decisions. Because too often, Lou, it'd be funny. I mean, it would be sad in a way, but funny.
It's funny now.
You'd actually have very senior executives, both of whom were stakeholders in the program, and who saw it very differently.
Yeah.
They
Sure.
had different views
Sure.
of what the outcome should be. They had different views about what would be the best path to get to success. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster,
Right,
on a large program.
Right.
And some of these programs were, as I said, I ran a multi-billion-dollar program. So this was big money we're talking about.
And multi-year, they go on.
Oh, absolutely. So
if you're off by a few degrees at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really gets bad. And so how do you get everybody on the same page in that model? And I'm just a huge believer in a governance model that, as I say, brings the right people together at the right time, with the right information. I mean, if you can do that on a regular basis, it's a way to drive success.
What kinds of things? Sure, that makes sense, especially for levels of management, maybe above the project team.
That's what I'm talking about,
right.
With governance.
Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things would you have on your agendas for those conversations? What could you forecast or predict could go right or go wrong, and things you knew you needed to keep in front of people? How did you manage the governance in sort of some of the mechanics of it?
Sure. We would leverage the project team members themselves, or the program team, to provide that right information. So let's start with basics. You have to understand where you're at in a good level of detail, exactly where we're at on the delivery of a program. So you need a good plan to start with. That's the schedule. That's all of the requirements you're going to be delivering, when you're going to be delivering them. This doesn't matter whether you're working in a traditional waterfall, whether you're agile. These are just basic good management concepts that you need to have these things.
Right.
And so once you have that plan, then first, having this governance, quote, body, all these stakeholders, understand that plan, buy into that plan, approve that plan before you get started is really key. So once you've got that, but let's talk about now you're in flight, right? The program's underway, and things will happen. Okay, there'll be new requirements that come in that you couldn't have foreseen before. Okay, that's what change. You always talk about change and dealing with change. You're going to have that happen. That's a given. Nothing's going to be perfect in your plan. So
right.
You might think it's perfect when you start, but very, very soon something's not going to
reality.
Reality hits, and you got to start dealing with that reality. And this is where the governance becomes so critical. So let's just take a real world kind of situation. We've got a new important requirement from the business that's come in. Let's say it's a private sector company, and there's a new market that's emerging that we need to address. These generated new requirements in our program. At the same time, we're struggling with some of our testing or whatever it may be. I'm an IT guy, right? So I'm about delivering systems, but it applies to any kind of program we're talking about. So we want to try to deliver more, yet we're running into issues on delivery itself. So this is a perfect kind of example to bring in front of this board to hear all views. So let's take from the business side, just how important is that we get to this market? Is this the most critical thing?
Right.
Would you be willing to forego other requirements right now that were in our plan, as an example, in order to deliver this?
Right.
Those are business kinds of questions.
Right.
Now, that's got to be tempered by the technology side or the program side saying, hey, we're struggling a bit with delivery. Here's what we can do or believe we can do where we're at. And so you got to have the reality. This is very important. so that everybody understands the challenges, so that when you make these kinds of decisions, everybody gets up from the table and they all have the same understanding of the facts and what are we going to do about it, whatever the
Yeah.
challenges are.
Yeah.
That is so meaningful, Lou, to a program. I mean, I just can't overstate how important it is to have that at a senior level. And as I said, the more complex, the larger the
Yeah.
program, the more important it becomes. So
Yeah.
you don't have somebody walking out of that room saying, well, those technology guys don't know what they're doing, or they're not heading us, they're not taking us in the right direction. No,
Yeah.
I was at the table. So, I mean, I'm part of this, and I'm part of the team. And that's back to your point, being on the same page. We may not like what the decision we had to make, but it was the best decision given the facts in front of us at that time.
And it's a continuous conversation, or it works best if it's a continuous conversation with those stakeholders. We've talked about this. I've been reimagining and rebranding my own consulting practice. Where I'm going to take something is about conversation, and it's relevant to what you just said. I've become very interested in understanding four things, Richard: what people see in a situation, what they make of it, what they would do about it, and why they would do that thing. And if I'm talking to you, I'm talking to personal relationship, doesn't matter. What I like to see if I can do is, can I understand what you understand the way you understand it? Even if I might or might not agree, that's separate. But do I have a picture clear in my mind that looks like the one you have in your mind, as much as we can do that? Do I understand what you understand the way you understand it? If I do, it gets me out of my head. We can have conversation about different things than I might have thought of. You might see something I didn't see. You might have
Yes.
sized it up in a way I didn't size, especially when we have different backgrounds.
Yes.
If you come from finance, if you come from HR, if you come from technology, you come from the customer side, we want people to have different things they bring to the conversation. So it seems to me that in the governance process, starting with having data, facts about where we are, what's emerged, what are we finding as we work, the kind of trade-off conversation you mentioned, new requirements come up, or difficulty in some area, or key personnel leaves. All these things happen.
All these things
happen. And then you have to have a conversation about what we do now. It's really important to know, and in your position you would have wanted to know, all these folks I'm talking to have that kind of shared understanding. We can come at something from different perspectives and backgrounds and responsibilities, but we are sharing something in this that substantially that we see the same way, we size up the same way, we would act on towards certain ends. And if not, you can talk about it and get aligned. There's that word back that comes back in my mind, get aligned. But if you're not on the same page about those kinds of things, you're not aligned. How do you make those trade-off decisions, or how do you stop a part of a project and reassess? Right? How do you then governance becomes challenging, maybe not even possible.
Maybe impossible. Well, let me pick up on your theme there, because I think you brought up some excellent points. So you're right. People come from very different backgrounds, and many times it's difficult, right, if they're very different than you, to understand their process for thinking through an issue, how they arrive at decisions. But what I have found, and it's not perfect, but if you can do a couple things. One, you got to make the time. Both parties do, if we're talking about just two trying to understand each other,
right,
to get to know each other, and to get into one. And that's one of the reasons I like a governance model where you're regularly meeting. Okay, it's like when I set up a program governance model on a major program, I want them meeting at least every month, and sometimes more often than that, because they've got to know the program real well, and they've got to know each other.
Right.
And that takes some time. And part of that process, and we haven't said the word yet, but I'll introduce it, is you want to build a trusted environment. And I say it that way for a reason, environment.
Right.
You obviously want to have individual trust between everybody, but you want an environment where people really are free or feel free to open up and speak what they really feel.
Right.
And
Right.
really, and if they like,
Right.
and have the trust that says, hey, if I
Yeah.
don't understand, I can admit that and let's talk through it so I can. Or I'm not, I mean, politics, like little p politics, always comes into play, but trying to come up with an environment where if we're all motivated to make this program successful, then let's put a lot of that aside and let's get to the what we all consider to be ground truth so we can deal with the issues and deal with them collectively. And as you say, you listen so we can let the best ideas come out
Yeah.
from this diverse group. And it's amazing sometimes what
Mm-hmm.
people will come up with
Mm-hmm.
in that kind of model. And you can see it. You can see it both ways. I mean, it's amazing to me that sometimes when you get in this right kind of trusted environment, you feel it.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
just feel it in your gut.
Yeah. You're right.
Everybody's open. We're having a great dialogue. We feel like we're really moving the ball forward.
Yeah.
And you know what? One person can kill that. That's the downside is if you get one person who wants to sabotage that kind of thing, they can do it pretty effectively. That's what makes this difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so you gotta really work on this, building this trusted environment. But if you can get it going well, it's hard to keep because change always happens. And as you say, new people come on and people leave and the like. But if you can build this trusted environment, I have seen more good come out of those kinds of relationships as a governance model than just about anything else I've seen in business.
I think I think we all have an experience and can tell a story, whether it came from sports we played or the work environment. Apart from a two-person relationship, apart from that,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a group
Yeah.
involved
Mm-hmm.
where you feel that juice that you talked about. You feel that vibe,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very palpable. It's very memorable.
Yes, it is.
And we would wish to have that again.
Mm-hmm.
To work that way, that esprit de corps amongst that team. And what something came to mind when you were saying about the trust and opening up. In that case, there's an approach motivation. People are motivated to lean in, to be in,
Mm-hmm.
to approach, to be to each other, connect, as opposed to the avoidance motivation when people back up, they
Mm-hmm.
guard, they
Yes.
safeguard, they hedge, and maybe not game playing. That's possible, but maybe legitimately protecting something they think could be at stake if they opened up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that trusted environment. Without it, you're probably lucky if a project goes off, completes as everybody had hoped, because there's too many things in that, whether it's the project team with that trusted environment or a more senior executive level.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yes.
too much counting on that openness.
Yes. Yes. Agreed. Yeah. And as a project manager, when I teach some program and project management, I talk about these things. And to your point, I kind of look at building a trusted team at the project team level, those that are actually on the project team, and then to what we've been talking about, the governance above that. Who are the stakeholders that should be part of key decisions that affect that project going forward. So the project manager or the program manager becomes in my mind, a critical person on both of those fronts, and it's not easy. And
no, it's not.
And it's a constantly has to be worked.
It does. I'm going to come back to the book on that with especially someone younger in their career, but I'm asking this question first because it came to my mind with what you just said. This is a tough one. There could be 10 people on your governance team. There could be many on a project team. They've got business objectives they're responsible for. They've got something personal at stake too. I don't mean that in any bad way. We have careers. We've got we have things we care about. Have you seen people align the personal and the business to keep them synced up for people so that they stay engaged and they don't sabotage? Because that's one way that people can sabotage is pull out because they run a personal agenda. But how have you seen that dynamic work out in groups that worked well?
Yeah, but let me almost take the opposite case. One thing I've learned is if you've got a saboteur, someone that really, and you try, I mean, you
Yeah.
try to either at a project team level or at a governance level, as we've been discussing, and they just will not, you know that they're never going to get there. And so, and as I said, one person can ruin the trust across the team. You know, I'm now a real believer that person needs to get out of the way, so to speak. I mean, you have to work through the program manager, for instance, project manager.
Yeah.
Somehow we got to get that person out, because otherwise your chances for success really go down.
They plummet.
So, I mean, I almost think it's maybe a negative way of looking at this, but because most, you know, what I have found, and you said it so well with like the esprit de corps, most people, when you get in that trusted environment and you've got a trusted team, it's like, this is really good. I mean, this is like,
Yeah, I
this
like
is
it.
really good stuff. I really want more of this. I want to be part of this team. I want to, you know, I want to do my share, and
Yeah.
you look at the greater good and all these things. And so once you can get that going, it can really propel you as a group. But you've got to make sure that you can get there. And that's why I say there can be obstacles, you know, and there are always people that you're getting there. And so this is where, and I don't know, maybe I've just learned through failure of trying to do this. I will work with someone for a while, but if they show me that they are just not willing to help build that trusted environment, then I'm looking to figure out how they can be replaced or you know, moved elsewhere, because it's just not. People just don't change. I mean, you know, they're just not, for whatever reason. You know, it could be ego. It could be that they have a real misgiving for another person on the team. You know, there's so many different factors here. But if they can't get over that and pretty quickly, then it's time to recast this. And if you're not in a position to do that, then and as you said, you can't always fix these things.
Right.
But I come back to it. It comes all the way back to the beginning of this alignment, getting people on the same page. If you have someone that's going to fight you in doing that, then you've got to figure out a way to get them off the team completely, so you can get everybody on the same page.
So let's step back from guys at our age in our career to younger. My daughters are like 28 and 31, and I think about them a lot. Supervisory positions, first level, team lead, supervisor positions.
Yes, and those are some of the toughest when you just started.
So you see the path they're on to get to the kinds of things that we're talking about. What kinds of things should they be thinking about and learning at that stage of a career to acquire this capability over time that we're talking about?
So I talk about it in the book on the leadership side, and you really should, and I didn't do it early enough, and I regret it, and I learned. But you know, there are courses on leadership, and not just like, you know, learn how to lead, like here are the 5 different leadership styles or something, although that's important, and I talk about that a bit in the book. But you know, leadership courses where you really get some introspection about who you are and the type of leader you should be, and what's most effective with a leadership style that fits you, because it's all about human relationships. And so, and I wish I knew that earlier in my career. So when people ask me about moving into managerial positions, and I discuss in the book, it's so hard when you have your first managerial position, because you're young, typically, not all, but most are relatively young. And so you don't have the maturity necessary. You don't have the experience leading others. And then a lot of times you're leading people that are young. and of course, they've got their own immaturity. So, you know, it's a kind of a double whammy.
And the worst situation is if you were one of them and came out of the team.
Yes.
That's hard.
That's hard too. And so I just believe the more you can take some courses that help you understand yourself, and that help you understand leadership styles and what best suits you, will do you well, will do you very well. both in the near term and certainly as you grow in leadership.
I think that's a
So
great answer.
that's my advice.
I think that's a great answer because when you're young, you might think learning about leadership is like learning about technology or models and methods for being a business analyst or some role, right? Some functional knowledge. And it is. There's things to learn about what it means to be a leader, but so much of what it means has to do with oneself.
That's correct.
For a good leader,
Yeah.
you can have a title. If you're, like you said at the very beginning, if you're a leader of people,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
you will not be a great leader of people if you're not really, if you can't face up with yourself, if you're not squared up with yourself. And that kind
Great,
of that kind of
great
introspection
statement.
probably goes all throughout your career.
It does. Yeah. And and it's not like I always get it right now,
Nope.
but I'm a much better leader than I was, certainly 30 years ago and even 20 or 10 years ago, because I've, continued to see things, understand myself better. And I think that can, as you say, translate into better leadership of others.
Well, let's shift gears here a bit. What happens when you can't get on the same page at some moment in time? Maybe you do, but what happens at that moment when we're not on the same page? And then I want to ask you about the book you're writing now, so you can sort of pick up where you want, and we'll follow your lead.
So you want to talk about when you can't get on the same page with someone?
What have you done?
And then you
Or
can't
not even someone.
you can't
Maybe.
just jettison them like my advice was, right?
Well, let's say this. Let's say you're
Yeah.
looking at the governance team, and you believe it's possible to get those folks on the same page about something that's come up, but they're not. What are the techniques you've used? What do you
Yeah.
ask? What do you say? How do you work that
So yeah,
conversation?
I definitely been in that position, both as a program manager and then as a CIO, and dealing with, let's say, peers or can even be superiors.
Yeah, true.
But it can be up the line even.
True.
I guess a couple of points here. I mean, one, it's a tough situation so you're in because you're not able, you don't seem to be able to get on the same page for whatever reason. Certainly in a non-group setting. I mean, one piece of advice is, particularly when you're trying to build a team, is I always say, praise in public, criticize in private. And it's so true. You want to be very, very careful of coming across critical of others in some kind of public forum. I mean, and even in private, you got to be measured.
It's delicate, right?
But delicate, right? That's well stated. But sometimes you have to take it on. I mean, you've got to say, hey, I just, well, first, why is it you feel this way? Try to understand, right? Try to understand the viewpoints from their perspective. What am I missing?
Right.
A lot of times agendas are being played, and those can become pretty difficult to deal with because irrespective of logic, they're not going to change.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the world.
Well said.
But try to understand their position first, and then if you can state your position and see if you can come to any kind of mutual understanding. But you have to be realistic too. And as I said, kind of as I've gotten older, I've realized I spent too much time at times trying to do that, because at some point you realize this person's never, for whatever reason, as I said, there's usually an agenda. For whatever reason, we're never going to see eye to eye on this. We're never going to get on the same page.
They have some different aim, and it's just not going to line up.
Yeah, right. Their objective function is different than mine. And now I might say mine's better or whatever, but that's perhaps a selfish view in some ways, but not always. I mean,
well, if you're responsible for something too,
I mean, part of it is, and like when I was in government, I was always like, look, I'm all about what's best for trying the agency, what's best for trying to make this place run better,
right?
And the problem is that some people there that was not their agenda,
right?
That clearly was not their primary purpose. So you got to deal with that, and you got to, once you understand it, you can at least try to work around it. If you can't, quote, get rid of them, so to speak, you can at least, I'm not trying to say play games, but perhaps do something that will help aid them in what their objective function is while not hurting the overall team.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can be difficult, though, depending on the situation. That's not always easy because a lot of times their objective function maybe even, I hate to say it, but maybe that there's another part of the team they'd like to see not successful. And so that's where it gets very, very awkward.
Yep.
So I don't know if I have more general advice right now, but you get into specific situations where I've mentored people where sometimes I've tried to help them navigate through some of these kinds of difficult situations.
Well, so maybe there's some negotiation that would be effective. Maybe
Yes.
not, maybe not, but maybe, and should be tried.
Yes, absolutely should be tried.
And if it doesn't look like you can reach any agreement that way, which is basically by talking about our separate and maybe mutual interests. If that doesn't work, the options narrow. In the conflict resolution work that I was taught in graduate school, you can go from an interest-based approach like that to more of a rights-based approach where you might call an authority your authority.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't work, you go into more of a power-based approach, which is in organizations is highly risky.
Yes.
And consequential, costly. So the interest-based approaches are considered more lower cost and have a higher chance of a good rate of return, but they don't always work. And
they don't. And even the rights-based approach, I have found many times does not work.
Right.
You might have the authority, but behind the scenes, that doesn't mean that authority is going to be honored.
That's right.
And I think you're naive if you think it will be at times when you're dealing with someone that truly is very much opposed to what you're trying to do.
And sometimes,
recognizing that is kind of important.
It is.
For your own good.
It is. Actually, you anticipated what I was thinking, because what I was about to say was, once you realize that, you have the chance to rethink things in your mind. Now, hold aside for a second what you do with your governance team or your project team. But in your mind, you can say, okay, if we're going to take some body blows, what do I do as a project lead or as an executive? What do I do to salvage as much of, if a project is a means to an end, right? It's to support somebody.
Yes.
What do I do to preserve as much of that means to accomplish as much of the end as is possible? And maybe you settle for that victory, because you might not get everything you'd hoped for at the outset when you had the charter and then the launch, right?
Well, now you brought up a really good point about sometimes, you want, back to the program example, you want this trusted environment. You want to have these lofty goals that if you had the right team and you're all marching in lockstep, you could achieve. But then if you've got one or even sometimes multiple challenges with some of the stakeholders regarding their motivations and what they're looking for out of this, that's when you got to, as you say, reset some expectations. I mean, what's given the situation, and I can't just wish them away. Right. I just can't get rid of these people.
Bewitched.
What's the best we can expect?
Yeah.
And and now, as you say, there's a power play side where you can go up the line and you can have these kinds of discussions, but that can be very dangerous.
Yes, it can.
Because once you start going up the line, I mean, where are who are your bosses, quote, up the line aligned with? What are their motivations?
Exactly.
About this topic. So it's
and there's too many unknowns, and you're probably just going to wish you hadn't.
Right. I will say this is a good place where having a inside mentor, someone that's more senior in the organization that you have a very trusted relationship with, can be very valuable to you, because that person can help give you perspective, perhaps help you give really understands the situation, and some of the people involved can really help you, especially earlier in your career when you tend to have less experience with these kinds of topics.
Sure. And let me tell you, when you're in one of these situations, it's stressful.
Oh, it can be very stressful.
And if if it's one of your first couple encounters, you don't have perspective. It's easy to lose perspective. You don't have a lot of experience to give you perspective, and the mentor can help bring some of that.
Yes.
That concludes the first of 2 episodes Richard and I recorded. Join us next week when we discuss his second book, which he hopes to publish this year, on how to make government more effective and efficient. We'll compare and contrast skills needed for program management with IT management, plus touch on the loss of citizen trust in government and how to restore it.